All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installation of Practical Creativity, the show where we deconstruct the creative process so that you can actually use it in your life and your work. And my name is Marte Siebenhar. I'm so excited to be here with Scott Harrison today, arts leader extraordinaire, somebody who I can't believe we hadn't met before. One of my high school friends, who I've actually known since probably preschool, introduced us. And I love the work that you've been doing with orchestras. And we had an amazing conversation geeking out about arts models. So I'm really, really thrilled for our conversation today. And Scott, why don't you take it away? Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you're up to right now.
Well, thanks, Marge. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to be here. I love the idea of practical creativity because I think that creativity has a science and a structure behind it if it's going to succeed. I think actually about many of the great composers of particularly the mid 20th century, the World War II era, and how when they had the greatest restrictions placed on them, access to musicians and materials and content, some of the greatest music flourished. So it's like in these boundaries, parameters, that creativity just grows. So I love the practical element to it. I've worked in arts administration my whole career for orchestras, performing arts centers, and just this whole sphere of how arts connects to and builds communities. I, for a number of years, was the executive director of Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, which was an organization that served all over Los Angeles County in all sorts of interesting ways with concerts and engagement content and discovery and learning and everything imaginable. And in the last few years, I've shifted my career a little bit into interim executive directorship. So I've been working with organizations on sort of transitioning their leadership as one leader is going out, as the next one is starting, helping with that transition, helping with sort of finding that next person, but also really helping them be really solid and not only solid and secure, but continue to be thoughtful, innovative, creative, and so that there's momentum building. Because I think transitions are actually time periods where momentum can happen. We're actually in a huge transition in the world right now. So that's sort of like a theme that maybe we'll come back to. But I spent 6 months with the Hawaii Symphony as their interim executive director, working with them and helping create a lot of positive change and momentum for that organization. Mm-hmm. And now I've just, in the last few weeks, come on board with the Louisiana Philharmonic, a fantastic orchestra and musical organization serving this idiosyncratic and amazing city that is a gumbo of all these great things that make up America. And I'm serving the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra right now as their interim executive director and senior strategic facilitator, and helping figure out not only what the orchestra looks like during this COVID era and how they stay present, relevant, vital, but also how we continue to build momentum to that future that I think they really envision for themselves, that we all envision for all of our arts organizations.
Amazing. You're so impressive in so many ways, but one of the things that I really, that really struck me as I got to know you a little bit was how you don't shy away from creative approaches. And that's actually something that a lot of traditional art forms are afraid of doing, afraid of experimenting, even though the art itself kind of begs creativity. Sometimes when we get into our director seats or our board seats, we want to get a little more conservative. So tell us just a little bit more about what are the creative approaches that you're excited to maybe try out in Louisiana, or some of the ones that have worked. Again, to your point, we are in a tremendous time of change, and this is an opportunity for all of us to get creative and to try new things, because pretty sure the old ways aren't going to work, just because we're being asked to do so many things that we wouldn't ordinarily do just in life, like don't be in groups of people or be inside, right?
Yeah.
How are you handling that? Or what are the things you're excited to experiment with?
Yeah, well, Marta, first of all, I couldn't agree more. It is sad sometimes how in artistic disciplines we can sometimes be so rigid and lack creativity around who and what we are and what we present. And so it's mind-boggling. If, we like to say in our field, in orchestras particularly, though all the classical art forms could say this, well, Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica was revolutionary when it was written, or Macbeth was revolutionary when it was written. If you're a repertory theater company or whatever you might point to in your field, yes. But then we shy away from any idea of sort of revolution or creativity or pushing the envelope in our current day. And so I think a very creative process, to go back to practical creativity, starts with a set of goals. And so, for example, here in Louisiana, what we spent the first few weeks together working on was sort of refining and reframing the goals. Like, who do we want to be and what do we want to accomplish this year? And so we talked about goals that are about serving the community first and foremost, and talking about how serving the community means a lot more than just concerts in a crowded concert hall. If your goal is to present concerts in a crowded concert hall, then you're stuck. There's nowhere to go from that right now. That's the goal, and there's only one thing you can do. If your goal is to serve the community through music, then there's a whole range of things you could do. So serve the community through music was number one. Number two is being present, projecting vitality, and building a bridge to the future. So creating opportunities and projects that really had this sense of life to them and a cadence to them. So this idea of, were we going to be kind of one or two big shots, big flashes in the pan, or are we going to have more of a cadence of activity that sort of built momentum over the year? That was the second goal. The third goal was, I should say, is, because we're still putting this in place, the third goal is this idea of helping to reactivate the city. That as the city comes back to life, culture, economy, nightlife, we are a driver in this city, in this town. In Louisiana, the arts is a $6 billion, it's actually 5.9, but let's round up. It's a $6 billion economic generator. So any sort of rebound in restaurants and small business, in downtown city cores, is going to be driven in large part by arts organizations. So reactivating the city. Then goals around the mix of activity, the mix of programming we want to have. We talk about how we want our programming to have the favorites, the meat and potatoes people love from the canon. We wanted New Orleans voices and sounds and artists represented across all genres. And we wanted to do this work that the Louisiana Philharmonic already does so well, which is expand voices and expand canon and put, spotlight and give platform to artists of all backgrounds. And beyond all that, the fifth goal is that through doing that, we're going to be able to raise funds based on a compelling case and a captivating sense of programming. So we started with those goals, and then from there, we started to build out these sandboxes, and that's where we really started to play. And I think in the name sandboxes, you can even start to see the idea that there's going to be boundaries and parameters, but a lot of room to play inside.
That's amazing. I love that, because I think all of us right now, I'll speak for all of us, sorry. All of us don't know what's coming, right? And so finding a sense of something to hold on to, something to really ground the work, is so important. And especially when you're working with a new team, which is always like fun and new challenges. But to lay out a framework, and I love that you have 5 goals that start with the community. Can you tell us a little bit more about your take on community and arts, and kind of like what's the relationship there in the ideal, and what do you find it actually is?
Well, I mean, the ideal should be it's everything. It's the only thing. It's like, that's who we serve and why we exist. And every answer is about the community. It's not about us. It's not about the board, the staff, the artists, the internal needs. Those all need to be met and addressed. Those are important constituencies and customers to serve, but in service of the community, of sort of bringing life. I mean, I believe that art spaces are democratic spaces, they're public spaces, they're gathering spaces. Like, if we talk about our country's democracy being a little bit under stress right now, well, arts places are actually part of the solution, because we are where people from different walks of life come together, develop empathy, learn to understand each other, learn to put yourself in someone else's shoes and hear their story. I mean, arts are central to democracy. But I realized that I remember the goals have evolved a little bit, and I left one out, or I think maybe I got one of them a little bit wrong, because as you were saying that, I realized the other goal we settled on, which I love, and a hat tip to my friend Alex Lang, who is a graduate of the New World Symphony for all our Miami watchers, and is principal clarinet of the Phoenix Symphony, and of course is just one of the most brilliant and thoughtful thinkers and artists in the arts field, but orchestras particularly. And Alex got me thinking about this thing that evolved into one of our other goals, is to spark the ABCs in our audiences. And I'll tell you what the ABCs are: affirmation, belonging, and community.
Amazing.
So we're going to help people kind of reconnect to each other and find themselves again and come back. So this sense of community is so multi-layered right now. It's community in terms of equity and reaching out further and wider. It's community in terms of listening and hearing what people need right now and being there to respond to and address those needs that we're sensing in the community. It's community in terms of the sort of bonds and the ties that are formed between people who like come together through the arts and feel this sense of purpose, this affirmation, this belonging. It's community in so many ways. You know, there's this director I worked with when I was in Los Angeles. We did a production of Kurt Weill's Lost in the Stars, his last stage work, and it's a gripping tale. It's a story of race and misunderstanding in pre-apartheid South Africa, but that Kurt Weill in the 1950s really wrote a sort of a parable for 1950s America, pre-civil rights, and frankly feels just as relevant today. And it's based on Alan Patton's On the Cry the Beloved Country, which a lot of people know. Anyway, when we were producing Lost in the Stars, Anne Bogart, who's the director of the City Company, this fantastic stage director, I was sitting in on some of Anne's creative process, and she said to the singers and the actors, she said, as we build this musical world, there are two sort of worlds or two communities I want you to think of at once. One community is the one on the stage, right? There's a community that exists sort of beyond the curtain, beyond the fourth wall, where you all form this sort of like, you know, this community that's a fantasy, but you're projecting out the story you're telling. But there is simultaneously another layer of a second community that breaks through the fourth wall and encompasses all the seats in the audience and frankly, maybe even beyond. And that's the community of everyone who's there to participate in the live artistic experience. And what community are you forming with those people? So can you, the singer actor, live in both communities at once? And for a musician or a dancer, a poet, any sort of art form that you might be, it's the same question. Can you create two communities at once, the community and the solidarity on stage, but then the one that extends beyond the stage, the proscenium, et cetera, to connect everybody?
I love that. I think it's really important for artists and for arts organizations to really embrace that. And I love the way that you put that, because it's kind of like meta. So you have your immediate thing and your immediate community, but also bringing people together in a space and for a purpose like the arts is automatically another kind of community. Affirmation, belonging, and community. These are so important. And, you know, for a traditionally white art form that has not necessarily been friendly to creating a sense of belonging. In fact, in a lot of ways, you know, the canon and the way that the arts training has been, and the institutions themselves have benefited a lot from, you know, white supremacy and from privilege. So how do you, and NOLA is an incredibly diverse place. There are people definitely from all walks of life, all genders and ethnicities, and, you know, racial belonging there. How do you create that sense of a bridge to not just say the thing, but do the thing, like to really create a sense of belonging for an art form that some people just don't identify with? Like, how do you do that? And if you can solve this problem, like the rest of everything will be solved for the arts, right? Like if we can really create belonging, like break the system. So how might you be doing that in New Orleans?
Well, we got like 20 minutes left in the podcast. We
right.
can you know, and I'm far from an expert, and I'm learning all the time. And but there's some things that I keep coming back to. The first is I'm going to hat tip to another friend, Chichi Nwanoko, who's the founder of the Chineke Orchestra in Great Britain, in the UK, which is this amazing institution that is similar to this, not completely, but similar in some ways to Sphinx here in the US, which folks know. It's an orchestra and an organization that centers the critical need to raise up Black and Latinx and other underrepresented voices and to create a more diverse art form and a more diverse future for the field. And what Chi-Chi always likes to say is, like, stop talking about it and just do it. Like, if the question is, how do you have a more diverse organization, have a more diverse organization. If the question is, how do you program more diverse music, program more diverse music. So in many ways, I go back to her, and that's the first thing I try to do is just do it. Yeah. And that's why I've been loving so much being here at the Louisiana Philharmonic, because when you start to look at their programs, you see that work is happening. I mean, you see the really thoughtful work that's being done to deconstruct and rebuild a canon. So when you look at the originally programmed season they had this year at the LPO, you see everyone from William Grant Still to Courtney Bryan, and in between, I mean, you see Vivian Fung, you see Tucker Fuller, you see Mozart alongside the Chevalier de Saint George. You see all these sort of ideas of how the canon exists in all these different ways with living and past composers, local, national, international, etc., and beyond. And so that's the first thing to me is just do it. Like, no more excuses. I mean, have an intentionality. Like, if you're building a season, don't be afraid to ask the question, is this season representing the full scope of what our art form is and who all the people are who work in it? And if it looks like it has holes missing, start to work on them and address them. And it's not about a one-to-one, like, well, we need this one person here, this one person there. It's about intentionality, about the whole scope. And so one of the things at the beginning of the process, whatever art form you're in, make sure your brainstorming process includes a lot of people that might be overlooked and might not be the go-to. So whether it's the composers, the choreographers, the playwrights, whether it's the musicians, the dancers, the actors, brainstorm in your process early a pool that has a lot of folks in it. So you have a lot of options to choose from, folks of all different racial, ethnic, gender, orientation, national, genre, backgrounds that make up the mix that your organization wants to be, and beyond. And so that to me is the first thing, like, just sort of start doing it. But I think defining clear goals is helpful. I think having a process where you say, this is how we want to move the needle, and this is how we'll measure success. You can have metrics in the diversity and equity sphere. I think that's really important and critical. I think a process that's outward bound, that's listening, that invites people, really ask them, how can we serve you? You know, top down is almost never going to be equitable. Bottom up very often will, not always, but very often will. So ask those questions. Realize it's hard work, make space for it. Realize you're going to make mistakes and fall down, and be willing to sort of dust off the scrapes and the bumps. I mean, the joke I always like to make is, you know, so people don't want to engage in the work of becoming more diverse and equitable because it's uncomfortable, right? And what does that mean? Well, for, you know, a guy like me, you know, and others like me, it might mean that we're, you know, the uncomfortableness might be that we're sitting in a ballroom at the Hilton at a conference and someone's talking the dirty truths about the exclusionary aspects of our field. Like, oh my gosh, that's so uncomfortable. How am I going to get through those 20 minutes and then go to the buffet lunch? That's my joke about the uncomfortableness, where the person whose story you're actually trying to represent, the people who feel excluded, the people who feel locked out, the real discomfort that they feel, the real sort of like hurt that has been put on them, and the real exclusion that they've had to deal with, and the ramifications that's had over their career, over their sense of affirmation and belonging and community. That's the real discomfort and hurt. So any of us can go through the minor, temporary, you know, intermediate discomfort to get to building this much more great thing. Because in the end, I'm firmly convinced, like, it's like the same way I think about fundraising. It's a growing pie. We're all going to benefit. Everyone is stronger when our art form is more diverse and equitable. The art's more interesting. It's more electric. Institutions are more interesting and electric. We have more support. We connect to more people. We're spending time actually working on things that matter rather than spending time apologizing and defending the mistakes we make. I mean, just look recently at establishment art forms that are constantly institutions that are constantly apologizing or making up for the mistakes that they made. Do you want to put your time into apologizing, or just put your time and your hard work into actually trying to do the right thing from the beginning? So that's the way I think about it, at least. And I'm sure even, you know, I'm sure even after this, someone will rightfully so point out something I missed, something I forgot, something I said wrong. And I want to hear it. I'm willing to hear it and take it and learn from it and improve for the next time.
I love what you're saying, and thank you for that, because I think it's especially important for white leaders to have this kind of conversation, to have it externally, to have it in a public facing way, and to be accountable. And so what I also love about what you're saying is, you know, the model has been insufficient in creating an us versus them. Like, we're the artists, we know, and you should be thankful, public, because we're sharing our genius with you or whatever. And that it's not necessarily like that's an extreme kind of view, but sometimes, you know, there's a bit of a dynamic and a creative tension between, you know, here's the art as it comes from artists, which is a very like personal individual thing, and then building an organization which was created in the public trust and who is, as you point out from the very beginning, community is the whole purpose, and sharing the cultural arts to enrich the community. That's a very different thing. So what you're really talking about doing, and not being afraid of doing, not sitting in a boardroom and just talking to death, but actually inviting people into your process, you're really talking about a radical shift in culture around the way that arts organizations be inside. And that is incredibly exciting for me. And I totally agree, when you suppress identity and you suppress ideas, you have a less rich, vibrant, meaningful experience for everybody. So creating belonging really, and kind of like hacking and questioning the way that we've always done it, because that way is not working. It hasn't been working. It's been hurtful. I wonder what that's like to actually make that kind of cultural change, because I imagine there are people who are also interested in keeping it the same. So how do you as a leader, especially as an interim leader, go ahead and broker that change and that culture of doing and being willing to make mistakes and get criticized, right? Because a lot of arts organizations are terrified of like getting it wrong, and they want to have the right answer and be perfect. Like this is not the point of the work, to your point. Discomfort's got to be part of it, because especially if it's a white institution, like that's the least you can do, right?
Yeah. Well, I want to share one more discomfort idea, and then I'll get back to the question too, because as you're talking, I realized, and this is like a good, in terms of like a practical thing. I was in a grant panel like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and every grant I spoke on, I think more or less probably every grant I spoke on, I talked about what was the diverse and equitable component of the grant application and the demonstration of their organization. And I didn't talk about it with every application, but I talked about it. I'm sorry, I didn't only talk about that, but I talked about it as part of it. And in my head, I had that inner monologue going like, "Oh, am I saying this too much? Am I kind of being the guy of diversity, equity?" So that's like an internal monologue discomfort that's coming on. But what I realized is, like, yes, let me not leave that to the person of color. Let me not leave that to the woman. Let me not leave that to the person from the LGBT community. Let me not leave it to someone else to have to bring that up. Let me do it, even if it feels uncomfortable and awkward because it's not how we normally talk. But let me bring it up every time. And so one of the things that it kind of leads into one of the issues is like, it is hard to understand where this balance is between doing it right and thoughtfully, and where you're sort of tokenizing.
Yes.
Where this balance is between being authentically engaged in the cultural experience of someone else versus being performative and just trying to kind of scratch the surface level.
Right.
And I have no doubt that I've, in my career, at times made the mistake of being on the performative side, being on the token side, being on whatever the wrong side of the coin is. I mean, I still maintain, and I probably maintain this less now than I did 6 months ago. I still maintain that, like, I don't think it's necessarily a completely bad thing if the place you start is just by trying to, if the error you make is to fall into some performative or token traps because you're trying to do the right thing, but then you learn and grow from that. I think that's still a net positive. It's a better place to not even be willing to try, or being so sort of blind to the issue that you don't even see the need to start to do the work or to engage the surface level. And again, I'm willing to take flack if that's too far behind. But I think that it's still, if you're doing that because you're on this path to trying to do better and you're listening and welcome to the feedback and then trying to move that away from that phase, I think that's a good thing. But I mean, to your question about like how you do this in organization, I think that you look for the values of the organization you're at, and you try to see how the values of being more equitable, diverse, accessible connect with what's already built into the organization. Because oftentimes there is something in the organization that is true and pure that if you can just connect with and show how this fits in, there's an understanding of, oh yes, this is us after all. So I think that's part of it. I think it takes some sort of forensics and digging, but I think you can get there and start to say, well, this is how pursuit of this is actually really who we are and what our art form is about. And so it's a good thing. I think there are other cases you can make. I talk about how there's an artistic, a business, and a moral case. So you can start at those different levels, but there is definitely a business case for why it makes more sense to be more diverse and equitable. That's not the only reason we do it. The moral reason is the most important. The artistic reason is secondary. The art is better, but I think that the business case exists, and that is often an on-ramp for people to understand that a little bit more and be willing to sort of get into it and see it. And just connecting to the larger conversations. I mean, what more powerful thing is there to say? I mean, if you point, well, in Miami, you might point to the Knight Foundation. Other places in the country, people will point to Mellon and say, look what the major funders are saying. Yeah. This is the world that they're helping us create, and they will be our partners and our friends and our allies if we do it the right way, but they're not going to tolerate or allow us to do it the wrong way. And they're proxies. We don't do it because of them and their money, but we certainly need resources to get the thing done. But they're proxies now speaking for a community of folks who don't have the same spot at the table. And our communities at the end of the day are asking us. We're community trust, community serving organizations. We get our charters, our licenses from our communities as 501c3s. They're asking us to do this work. And so it's really about being responsive to them and taking that really seriously.
Right. And it's time. It's been time for a long time. And so I'm really hopeful and excited about people like you talking about this, making change and starting to question, like what were we benefiting from that actually wasn't benefiting other people, and how can we proactively make this not just a performative thing, but like bake it into our practices and really look at where we've been exclusionary, from our vendors to the consultants we work with to the people that we hire on and off the stage. So I think that's really important. Let's also get back to creativity, and this is all very creative. Like, you're creatively rebuilding an organization, which is awesome. And again, LPO Music is the handle on Instagram and Facebook. Tell us more. What does creativity actually mean to you, Scott? And how does it show up in your own life, when you're not at work?
What does creativity mean to me? I think creativity is a question mark, probably. I think creativity is just like being curious and wanting to know more and wanting to find out why and exploring. I think like creativity is born out of a question mark. So I guess in my own life, I love to read. I love to explore. I love to ask questions. I love to do things I don't know. I love to adventure. I love to travel. I don't get to do so much of it now. One of my favorite activities is just to walk. I love just getting out in the neighborhood and walking around, and I can walk for hours. Unfortunately, my daughter can't keep up, so I don't get to walk for hours as much as I want to anymore. But I don't know. I think that's maybe the way I would think of creativity. Is it's about sort of questioning and curiosity, and then at some point you turn that into something interesting and intriguing and meaningful for someone else. And that's how I think it shows up in my life, is just wanting to live a very adventurous and curious and questioning sort of existence.
Totally agree. And there is a bit of courage about going into the unknown, but that's kind of what creativity is. That's kind of what curiosity is. That's kind of what being an artist is all about. And you studied a classical instrument, and tell us more about what creativity looked like in that whole discovery of training as an artist.
Yeah. And by the way, Marty, you just said into the unknown. So if anyone else out there is a parent or an uncle or an aunt to a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old like I am, you hear into the unknown, you think of Frozen, but that's another answer too, or Frozen 2. That's another answer to creativity, is going into the unknown. But I lost myself on the question. Bassoon, studying a classical instrument growing up, and where did creativity come into that? Well, it's interesting. In many ways, it doesn't in the beginning. A lot of the study of a classical instrument, just like a classical dance form or a classical acting form, can be very rote and can be very discipline-based. And that's a good thing in part. You want to master the craft, because it's through mastery that the creativity can really be sort of expressed. So I think some of that is good. But for me, the truth is, a lot of kids, if I think a lot of peers and kids who got into music and friends, they didn't always necessarily get into the creative element of it. They were just so into the rote part of it, the discipline or the marking off the notes. I think it's a place that we can improve. I love actually the classes my daughter took for many years when we were in LA at the Colburn School, the early childhood music classes, because they're so creatively based. They're about storytelling and using your voice and having fun. And so for me, I kind of sought a lot of it out on my own. I dabbled with composing a little bit when I was younger. I moved to saxophone for a bit and did jazz. I was in a multidisciplinary arts program in high school that worked across disciplines and people from all sort of artistic backgrounds, and that exposed me to a lot of different ideas of sort of creating art and using my music and other art forms and voice. It's great. We did film production. We created a musical from scratch. We explored all the different arts forms, etc. So yeah, I think it's on the one hand, craft matters. And if you're going to really, if you're eagle-eyed, like I'm going to be a performer in a certain field, you've got to sort of, you've got to pursue that craft to a point where you can express yourself. I kind of think about it the way I think about what they talk about with sports now, and how we've gotten to a point where children have specialized so much in sports so young that they're developing these injuries that you shouldn't see in children of that age, like middle school and high school kids who are specializing in soccer and travel soccer. And, I'm just using soccer as the example, and they tear their ACL at 16, which they should not be doing. And instead it's the kids who have a well-rounded athletic and physical experience who actually, in the end, are the most resilient and healthy, and actually oftentimes develop into the greatest athletes. It's, in a way, I would think it's the same thing in music and art and theater over time. It's like the well-roundedness will actually serve you better. And whatever you might lose in terms of perhaps not having some degree of complete excellence in a particularly sort of chiseled point of the manifestation of the instrument, I think you'll gain as being a much more well-rounded artist and individual.
So true. I love that. I remember when I was little, also same thing, like art museums and making up puppet shows with my best friend and writing long short stories and drawing and everything.
Yeah.
So, and I was very lucky to have people who encouraged me to use my imagination.
Yeah.
I also find it a lot more fun as an adult to realize like there are moments that I can work and moments that I can play, and sometimes my work allows me to play, kind of like how I feel right now. So thank you.
Yeah.
It's nice to have cool people to bring into a playful space. Let me ask you also, how do you, as a leader, as a human being, how do you recognize creativity in other people? Like, what does that look like for you?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'd probably first go back to where I defined it. I think someone who asks a lot of questions is probably a creative person. I think someone who speaks with passion about the things they believe in or are supporting or advocating for is a creative person. So looking for questioning or inquisitiveness, looking for passion. I think there's definitely, this might sound counterintuitive, but there's a level of seriousness, because I think people who are creative are really driven and want to accomplish the thing. I think this idea that creativity is loopy or creativity is hazy or creativity is sort of like, I think creative people are some of the most hardworking and driven. And I think you see at the top of any artistic art form, whatever it might be. So I don't know. I think those are some of the things that tip me off to someone being creative. But I think it's also like there's a body language. It's how they respond as you're talking. It's how they connect with you. It's if they hear you, because creative people, I think, taking a lot of inputs, and the person who doesn't hear, might be great. The person who doesn't hear might be great at executing the art, but it's probably not a very creative person because they're not getting the necessary inputs to form anything new or bring something different to the table.
That's interesting, because a lot of inputs. That reminds me, going back to our conversation about diversity. They say that, there is evidence out there, lots of it, that diverse teams are more innovative. So being able to take many inputs and translate those into a solution just makes sense. I've never asked anyone that question, and it just came to me, and I just love your answer. I think that's.
What would you add to it? What else do you think sort of reads for creativity in someone?
Yeah, I think similarly, lots of questions. Somebody who's really curious. That seriousness. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think a lot of times there is gravitas. There is a lot of thoughtfulness that is being put into that. So I don't know that I can think of anything to add right now. I think that's pretty comprehensive, and thank you for that. We wanted to talk about models as well.
Yeah.
I'm kind of running out of time here, but how do you think our models for the arts could be more creative? What do you think we're missing? What have we been missing?
Yeah, these are questions I'm asking myself. I think I'm very much more and more thinking about a broader scope of artistic leadership. I think the idea of a single artistic director, music director, whatever your general director, whatever your institution might be. It doesn't mean that there isn't someone who's ultimately accountable and has ownership. But I think building a circle of artistic leaders is a really powerful thing. I know they do this at San Francisco Jazz in San Francisco. I know they do this in Chicago at I'm drawing a blank. What is the great I want to say Roundabout, but that's New York. What is the great theater in Chicago that does this? That I think is also, it's not the Goodman.
No.
It's also with an R.
It's the one with the really cool name.
Leadership model. What's that?
It's the one with the really cool name. Steppenwolf?
Practical creativity. I've got to operate on top of a lawnmower right now. So one of the hazards of our new world.
Yes. Well, at least it's not the tornado or the hurricane sirens.
Yeah.
Is it Steppenwolf?
Oh my gosh, he must be right under the window right now. Here's what I'm going to do for a second. I'm going to see if I can do that.
Can you hear me now?
And do this.
Does that work? Does that work?
Do this. Okay, Martin. I hear you now. Perfect.
Hanger the whole day. Okay. Is it Steppenwolf or is it something else?
Oh, I think it is Steppenwolf. I was one letter off. So,
okay.
But yeah, I was thinking Roundabout New York, but it's Steppenwolf. But in the music field now, we started to experiment with this when I was at LA Chamber Orchestra. We started to build a larger artistic leadership cohort. It was not only Jaime Martin, our music director. We complemented him with Ellen Reed and Derek Spiva. In San Francisco, Esa-Pekka Salonen started doing this when he was appointed music director. I'd like to say he followed our lead at LACO, but I don't know if he was aware of it. But I think more and more this idea of bringing more voices to the table, that's one of the models that I think needs to change. I think figuring out boards, there's a lot of work to do to figure out boards because boards need to be more in tune with and representative of the communities they serve. They need to lean more into their governance responsibility. In the meantime, we have no answer for the idea that we rely on boards to provide the philanthropic engine. So I don't know if anyone at Knight or Mellon is listening, but we need some sort of, for the organizations that are willing to do the right work, we need some sort of bridge from having a board that is primarily the philanthropic engine to one that is primarily a kind of community and strategic engine. And as a result of doing that work right, you ultimately will, I think, generate more revenue in the long term, but there will be a uncomfortable bridge to gap to get over. So I think boards are open a lot.
Yes.
I actually think, this might not sound new, but I think clarity is so critical. And I see so many organizations that their response is that they want to break down silos, which is a good thing. And I've talked about this a lot. I am a big proponent of breaking down silos, but break them down to the point where they don't want to define anyone's job. And even in a diffuse and model, and in a very horizontal model, which I love, we need to define people's jobs and roles on the staff, on the board, and the artist, because otherwise organizations don't get anywhere. There's no accountability, there's no ownership. So I think all these things sort of have to exist. And I think we just have to get out of this idea of I think the biggest model shift is this idea that we kind of talked a little bit, excellence above all else. And excellence, I think, is a barrier word. I think it's impact above all else. A component of impact is craft. A component of impact is sort of mastery. A component of impact is curation. A component of impact is a real vibrancy. But excellence to me is a word that is exclusionary and is just about this idea of I'm going to get really good at this one thing the way it was done for many years, the way my teacher, till his or her teacher,
conservatory model, yes.
Yeah. So those are some of the things I think. I don't have answers yet to any of those things, and it's one of the toughest things is to and presumably any organizational change and growth never stops, right? So presumably you're always in this.
It shouldn't.
You're probably always in this phase where the model is never quite caught up to the ideas and the energy you might have in the institution, but it feels like there's a good moment now to catch up a bit more and get a little close the latency a little bit.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up about excellence. I just finished a strategic plan with a partner on for a small national foundation, and they wanted to talk about excellence through equity. And just excellence means so many different things for for so many people. And we were doing this with a lens on equity. The whole plan was like, how does education live its privilege in a way that is equitable and that could revolutionize their fields by actually, you know, looking at every aspect of what they're doing, being clear about their goals, and then being accountable. But excellence came up 100% as a coded word for an exclusionary practice. So they actually stopped using that word, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, okay. I think. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say. I think the irony is that, you know, for anyone who says diversity, you know, someone says, "Well, you're going to try and become more diverse, but what about the quality?" You know, another one of those code words. It's like that's actually the complete wrong answer. Diversity increases quality. Diversity makes things more excellent. Diversity makes things better. And I think the best example is sports. I mean, I think we have so much to learn from sports actually in our field. And look at, I'll take Major League Baseball as an example, but actually the NBA is the same case. Look how much better the quality of the game and the product is when they increase the pool of people who participated. When MLB went international, it's diversity in a different way. But when MLB went international, when the NBA went international, look how much better the quality. I mean, you know, the truth is as great as they might have been, the teams of the past, if you really to do this thing of like put a team from the past against a team from the present, they couldn't hold up because they were drawn from a smaller pool. And so the idea is like, if we work to get more people engaged in our art forms and want to participate and wanting to be part of who we are, we're going to be better and stronger and more interesting because there's just so much more to choose from. So many more people, you know, it's math. I mean, diversity is math at the end of the day. If you have besides all the research on diversity bonus about these sort of the cognitive benefits to diverse teams, but if you had 1 million people in a non-diverse world from which to draw from, and you have 5 million people in a diverse approach to the world from which to draw from, you're all of a sudden going to come up with a better team at the end of the day. Like
you were saying, multiple inputs. Like the more inputs that you have that are different, the better ideas. It's just, in that way, I hear you about the map. Last question, and thank you for spending so much time with us. I could talk to you all day about all of these things and never get tired, but I do want to respect everybody's time. Last question is, this is an extraordinary time of disruption and uncertainty. What is your hope for what we learn and start to own or do differently only because it comes from this time?
I think my greatest hope will be we learn that disruption in a way is actually the normal. That uncertainty is maybe the better word. That uncertainty is actually the normal. Like, we should never take anything for granted. We should always be preparing for potential multiple futures. We should always be ready to roll with the changes. We should always be thinking ahead. We should we should never make the fault that we all make, because it's one of the biases we all carry, that we assume the future will be like the present because the present is very seeable, knowable, and comfortable. And so that's my greatest hope, is that we just get comfortable with uncertainty. We get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes.
And we get more certain that uncertainty is the way of the future.
That's so great. I totally agree. Just being 10% braver every day, or 1%, will get us very far. Well, Scott, I want to thank you for joining me. I hope this is the first of many conversations, and the second of many conversations.
That's right.
And thank you for all you're doing in New Orleans right now. And if anyone is looking to find you, they can find Louisiana Philharmonic at LPO Music. And I'll drop your LinkedIn profile into the show notes on LinkedIn, on YouTube as well. And any other things that came up, we'll be sure to put in the comments so that everybody has access to it. But thank you so much for joining us. And everyone, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay creative.
Thanks, Marta.
Thank you.